I'm Andrew Delaney. I'm a principal support engineer here at Qlik, and I focus on Qlik. I've been working with Qlik for more than 3 years now, and this is a increasingly old photo of me on the right-hand side. So what are we going to go through today? We're going to go through what the monitoring apps are, how they work, some of the limitations and the defaults that they use, and then we're going to go through how to configure them. And we're going to list how to configure them in a single node site and in a multi-node site, and then I'm going to go through a demonstration of actually performing those steps for a multi-node site. So let's get to it. What are the monitoring apps? So the monitoring apps are a series of applications that come with QlikSense. Two of them are pre-installed. They are intended to help you get a better idea of what's happening in your environment. So the operations monitor, it gives you an overall view of the QlikSense deployment. It tracks 3 months of history. It is one of the two that are installed by default. It's intended to allow admins to track high-level server performance, reload timing and trends, app and user trends, that kind of thing, and also see some information about the health of the system, what errors are being generated. It's also intended for app developers to be able to use it to help gauge how their applications are being adopted as well. Then you've got the license monitor. So it's there to help you track license usage, how many tokens are being used, if your users are actually logging in and using passes, that kind of thing. Then you've got these three, which are not installed by default. They're kind of smaller, more focused. Well, the sessions monitor and reloads monitor are smaller, more focused kind of excerpts from the operations monitor to help you look at engine sessions and reloads in specific. And the logs monitor is meant to allow you to get a greater view and explore the QlikSense logs themselves. But they aren't in a state where we're comfortable with just putting them up for everyone to look at. They are all available in the default apps directory in your QlikSense install, so you can get them very easily, but they're not included in the instance at install. So how do they work? So the monitoring apps work by looking at the log files or the logging database if you're using the logging service, and they then store the information that they read from there into QVDs in the program data folder, and they also read information from the repository using pre-configured REST connectors, and that's how it gets information, more information at least, about apps and app objects and licenses and users. So by default, it will actually use that logging database first. And another thing I should note here is that these REST connections count towards your session limit per user, which is there's a 5 simultaneous session limit, which is why from April we've recommended against giving your service user tokens, because then when you try and use the service user on the hub, you'll see messages about not having an access pass available. Okay, so defaults. As I said before, only the operations monitor and license monitor are installed by default. And we will use the logging database over the logs if the logging database is present. This is something that can be changed by modifying the script. Similarly, we only actually, by default, have the monitoring apps available on the central engine, and the monitoring apps get reloaded every hour. And what are the limitations? So the data in these apps is not live. It's reloaded every hour, right? As I literally just said. The error messages and numbers aren't ideal in that QlikSense will generate errors when everything is working fine. My main example for this is when QlikSense starts up, the services all enter a started state very quickly, but don't actually finish starting up for a while, and all of the services rely on the repository and will generate errors until the repository itself is up and running. So it's actually quite normal to see those errors. But on the other hand, if you were to filter them out, you would then not necessarily see when a service continues to get those errors for a long time because it's for some reason unable to connect to the repository service on that node. So not all errors are actually meaningful. Sometimes its context is very important, unfortunately. And then also we get no data from the service dispatcher services. This is an increasingly large number of very small services that do very specific things, but they use a different log format. And most of these service logs don't get archived, so they're not in the same location as everything else. And so because they don't get archived, because they don't use the same format, the monitoring apps don't see them. All right, so how do you configure the monitoring apps? On a single node system, you can rely a lot on the pre-configured things working. So you just need to ensure that the archived log folder points to the right location. You need to make sure that the REST connections that are set up go through a virtual proxy with Windows authentication, which, if you don't change anything, is the default proxy and is the proxy that it will already be set up to connect to. And finally, you need to ensure that you're using the service account. And if that's not present, that's very easy to fix. You just enter the service account credentials into the connection and click Save. Most of this is actually done for you on install. So the only reason why you'd ever really need to deal with this on a single node system is you've changed the service account, or you've accidentally had someone delete a data connection and you need to recreate it, or actually, those are the only ones I can think of. I'm sure there are others, but those are the main things that you're going to encounter. All right, but with a multi-node system, it's a bit more complicated. It's much more dependent on what you're using for your logging, whether you're using the logging service or the logging, or just using the log files. But there are some things that are in common. So we're going to go through the common bits, and then we're going to go through the other, the two specific scenarios. So firstly, those REST connections, they're always going to be used. They need to go to a virtual proxy with Windows authentication. Our documentation suggests the central node. It doesn't actually have to be the central node. As long as it's going to a virtual proxy with Windows authentication, that's fine. So you need to point it at that. You need to ensure that the service account is present in the user ID field so that we know that it's using the right credentials. And you need to share your program data folder, the log folder rather, for the central node, and update that data connection. And this is actually very important because otherwise it will technically reload, but you're going to start seeing weird inconsistencies in your data depending on where the monitoring apps reload. So this is where we store our QVDs, so that's why it's important. Otherwise, what's going to happen is, depending on which node it reloads on, you're going to have different QVDs, and we try and avoid doing duplication, which means that you're going to start running into data missing depending on which node it's run on. It's confusing. Just make sure you got the share set up. And finally, this is optional, but this actually does then factor into the other decisions. If you want those monitoring apps to be present and reloaded on room nodes, you need to modify the load balancing rule. So by default, there is a load balancing rule that is set up in your QlikSense environment that specifically excludes anything published to the monitoring app stream from appearing on any room nodes. So you just need to change the condition and remove that condition on that rule, and I'm going to go through that in the demonstration. So then, if you're using the centralized logging, so it's an optional install, you can set it up later, but if you're using that, you have to use it on every single node. If you don't use it on every single node, then you're going to have those nodes effectively completely missing from your monitoring apps, because we are not going to read the log files, we're just going to read the logging database. And if those nodes are not logging to that database, they're just not going to appear. So you need to update the Qlogs data connection to point to your logging database. It's normally on the same server as your central repository, but it depends on how you've decided to set things up. And you need to make sure that the user ID is the Qlogs reader. By default, that is Qlogs reader, and it uses the password you provided when you set it up. If you want to use the log files, you need to do some different changes. You need to make sure that your archived log folder points to the right folder. On your share, use the fully qualified domain name. And if you want the monitoring apps to have timely information, you want to share the log folder on every single node, and you need to modify the the load script for all of your monitoring apps to also use those new connections. And that's what we're going to go through in our demonstration. It takes a little while to do, unfortunately, but once you've got it set up, it's fairly straightforward. And then, unfortunately, it's also the kind of thing that you will need to do every time you upgrade, because we'll give you a new copy of the apps, and we won't maintain the load script, so you're going to need to make these modifications every time you upgrade. And if you don't do this, the reloads will work, the data will appear, but you may have, for your RIM nodes, up to a 13-hour delay on some of your data, because what happens is we archive logs every 12 hours, and if that archive happens to happen just after you reload, it can then take another hour to for the monitoring app to reload again and then actually pull that data in. So that's why you need to do this. It's if you don't care that you can have up to that 13-hour delay, then that's fine and it will work. All right, now what we're going to do is I'm going to go through the steps for configuring the monitoring apps in a multi-node environment where we're going to use the log files. So to do that, I have prepared an environment. So this environment is a fairly simple environment. It's a 3-node cluster. And what I've done is I've set up one of our RIM nodes specifically to do all of our reloads. So what that means is I've actually already broken our monitoring apps as a result of this, because I've done no other configuration. And so if I go to our tasks here, you can see all of these have failed. And they've failed for a very simple reason: no slave scheduler found. And that's because, as I mentioned previously, by default, we don't actually allow the monitoring apps to be available on RIM nodes. And since I've got a RIM node that does all of my reloads, it can't see the monitoring apps to reload them. So that's the very first thing that we're going to fix. We're just going to adjust our load balancing rules here. So the default load balancing rule, this is, a very long string, but all it is it's the stream ID of the monitoring app stream, and we're removing that. But before we do that, I'm just going to show you the other aspect that I was talking about. So if you go to the hub, here's our hub on Qlik server 1, which is our central node. And if I go to monitoring apps here, you can see all 5 monitoring apps because I imported the other monitoring apps as well. And if I do the same thing, so I go to that monitoring app stream, they're simply not present. So I don't see them at all. So if I now edit this rule and I remove this condition and click apply, I can refresh this, and suddenly our monitoring apps will be visible and usable here on our RIM node. All right, so the next step, we need to go to our data connections, and we need to make sure our data connections are correct. So here we've got all of these. So right now, because all of my proxies are actually using Windows authentication, I know that actually it doesn't matter that these are pointed at localhost, but let's say in the future I want to start using SAML authentication, and I've got a specific RIM node that they're going to use, and I want to change that default proxy. I want to preserve this, so I'm going to make sure everything points to the central node. So what I need to do is I need to replace localhost in every single one of these applications. So, in every single one of these connection strings. And this is a little tedious, but also pretty simple. I'm just finding localhost and replacing it with qlikserver1.domain.local, which is the fully qualified domain name of my central node. So I need to go through all of these data connections and make that change. And since each of the strings is slightly different, I can't just, one way I could have potentially sped this up would have been to save it in a text file or something and copy and paste each string but that isn't really the way I would expect someone to do it in the real world. So I'm just going to go quickly through each of these and find and replace. It's pretty straightforward to do. It's just not very entertaining. Unfortunately, you should only need to do this once unless you decide to change your default proxy, in which case you're going to need to do it multiple times. But when you upgrade, we don't override these data connections if they exist already, so it should be fine. It should continue to work. But you know, if your monitoring apps stop working, then this is one of the things that you can check and make sure this is pointing towards the right nodes. And we've just got 3 left to do. And as you can see, I'm just using my browser's find function. It doesn't take too much work here. All right, one last one to go. So here we are. So then what we're not doing is we are not using our logging database, so I'm not going to bother with that. We do need to check our server log folder, so this isn't correct. We need to fix that up. So we will go here to program data. We're going to go to our log folder, and you can actually see the QVDs from when it previously was working, and I need to share this folder. Here we are. So I share this. I just can leave it at this because what happens is our service user is part of the QlikSense service users group, so it already should have access. So I'm just sharing it as log, and then I need to change this. So this becomes clickserver1.domain.local/log, and I'm going to put in our service account credentials so I know that they're right. And so that one is set up. So the next step, now we've done all of that, we can also double check that this is pointed at the right thing. So this was set up already. That is correct. So that's fine. So now what we need to do is we need to create the data connections that we're going to use for our RIM nodes. And we need to also do the same sharing that we did before there. So here is our second node. And what we're doing is we're navigating to the same point. So click sense log, and we're sharing that. And I already did this previously on the other node, so I'm only going to do it on ClickServer 2, but obviously I needed to do it on ClickServer 3 as well. And now we need to modify the load script. So we will go to the hub, and the simplest thing to do here is to make a duplicate of the app. So you can do that in QMC, in the app section. I already did this earlier, but it's simply a matter of going here and duplicate. And so we can now go to our license monitor. And we can go to our license monitor in work, and we can modify this. So we now go to our data load editor. So this is also where we get to make our folder data connections, which we need for this. So once the connections load here, we're just going to create 2 new connections. So we want all files in a particular location, and this becomes clickserver2.domain.local. Apparently I can't type today. /log/logs. Nope, /log. And we're going to call this clickserver2. And we'll create that. Now, the downside of this is that it is, of course, actually adding my account name at the end of these connections. So what we're going to do is we're going to ignore that for right now, but I'm going to need to modify that in the server. So .domain.local/ /log, and we create that, and this becomes Qlik server 3. All right, so now we need to modify in here, in the log folder list function, we need to modify this string here. For each node in server log folder, then we just add our 2 new data connections, Qlik server 2 and Qlik server 3. And there we've made the changes that we need. Now the thing is, if I hit load data, this isn't going to work because obviously these connections aren't the same, but also all of those REST connections that we were using before, we can't see right now. So we can't actually load the data with this user. I could fix this fairly easily by making a rule that would give this user access to them, but what I'm actually going to do instead is I'm going to change the owner of these things. So let's modify the things we need to modify here. Oh, actually one last thing. So in the initialization, we can set whether or not we are going to use a logging database, the file logs, or the database logs only. So I don't actually need to make this change since I haven't set up the database logging, but this is where you set it. You just make a change here and everything will work correctly. So we've done that, and now we can save our script. We can go to apps, back to data connections, and we can modify these. So this, we're just going to strip the name of the user that created it off the end. We're going to change the owner to SA repository, which is the same as all of the other ones, and we're going to add our service user here, and we're going to make the exact same change to Qlik server 3. Okay, so now I've made that. We can now publish our application. And I'm also actually going to change the owner of the application. So this becomes SA repository. And I'm going to publish it with a slightly different name, just so we can check that it worked correctly. So we'll publish this. We're publishing it to the monitoring app stream, and we're calling it license monitor with room nodes. And we can publish that, and now we can also reload that. So if I click reload now, it's going to create a one-shot task. That should make the thing reload. So you should work. Come on. Let's refresh this. There we go. It started. It was sent to 2. It wasn't immediately rejected by 2, which these ones I could also start reloading now. They will work. They just won't include all of the things from the rim nodes. So I might start them going as well. All right, there we go. So that finished. The script log also will show that it ran through and reloaded, and we can take a look at the applications. So if I go back to here and I go to monitoring apps, I can see license monitor with rim nodes, and we can take a look. So here is our thing. This is a very quiet system since it was set up for this. We can see the access. We can see that it's reloaded. So one other thing I should note about all of the monitoring apps, not just this one, there is actually a set of stories to help explain what these apps are for and how you can use them. And so that's something that, especially if you've not really spent much time with the monitoring apps, is a great way to get an idea of what you can do with them. And yeah, so that's present in every single one of these. All right, so with that done, and that reloaded correctly, we'll just check on our other ones. Why did you fail? No, you didn't. This just hasn't updated. All right, great, good. Let's now go back to our presentation, and we are up to the Q&A section. So, uh, all right, let's go through this. I've got one question, which is, how do you install the log session reloads monitoring apps under stream? That's a yeah, fairly sensible question to ask. So if I go to the correct VApp, all right, now all of the monitoring apps are actually available, and this is also important if you have someone that, say, accidentally deletes them, in the repository folder in the default apps folder. So they're all here. You can import them. You can then modify them. You can create your own monitoring apps, whatever, but they're all available here. So all you need to do is go into QMC and go to apps and import them. So the import button here, and you pick a file, you go to that folder. Obviously, the last ones I imported were there, so this has gone straight to the right folder, but as I said, it is in program data, Qlik, sense, repository, default apps. Okay. I also, someone wanted me to repeat why you shouldn't assign a token to the service account, and that's because of these REST connections. Sorry, it's over here. So due to changes related to the analyzer and professional licenses, I understand, we changed when the check is done on licenses. And so the check is actually done here. It doesn't require a token to make these calls, but it does in effect consume a session. It doesn't consume usage, and if you, for example, were using login access passes, it wouldn't consume a pass, but it does consume a session, and you can only have 5 sessions open at once, and then you start getting, you know, rejected when you try and go to the hub and actually use it. So that's why you shouldn't do that with a service account. Someone said monitor REST connections aren't working with Kerberos proxy authentication. That is correct. I probably should have been a little bit more specific when I was talking about the proxy requiring Windows authentication. It requires Windows authentication without, but not Kerberos authentication. It's very specific, which is somewhat frustrating, but unfortunately you just can't use it with a Kerberos proxy. Okay, how are existing monitoring apps affected when new Qlik Sense version is released? Any customizations overwritten? Is there a best practice for upgrading the apps? So when you upgrade Qlik Sense, and unfortunately this system is a fresh system, so I can't really show it to you, what will happen is your existing monitoring apps will be renamed, and you'll see them in here with the old version name. So they will still exist, and you'll still be able to get at the script and the data that was in them, but and we won't change the REST connections, but if you made any changes to the apps themselves, so you've made that change to the script, you'll need to make the change to the script again. And if you made changes to like the actual look of the application or objects in it, unfortunately you'll need to make those changes as well. Does having the monitoring apps out on the RIM impact performance? So the monitoring apps, like, it shouldn't have any performance implications. I think the main reason why we would default to only having them on the central node is it makes it less complicated to configure. So there's a lot of automatic configuration that occurs. So it's just simpler to do that automatic configuration where you're only needing to worry about the central node. The central node is also the only node that automatically gets a proxy that has an engine attached to it. And if you've spent a lot of time with Qlik Sense, you'll know that unfortunately the monitoring apps are very brittle, so they have a tendency to break if you make many system changes, which is why one of the reasons for going through this in a Expert Thursday is to try and provide some feedback on how you can configure them and hopefully how you can then have them not break. Someone was just asking to see the Sessions app. Okay, sure. Keeping in mind that in this environment, not a whole lot is happening, you're not necessarily going to get a huge amount of information from this look, but it's here. But also, as I said, in the uh, in the app, there is a story to help talk about how you would use this. The sessions monitor also, I believe, defaults to a shorter time period, although this is all configurable if you modify the data load script. So if you go to the help site, there is information on how to set up the QlikSense monitoring apps for multiple nodes. The problem that you're going to have is that documentation isn't the best. The next version of QlikSense of the QlikSense help site should actually have a revised one, which kind of splits it up in the same way that I did in this presentation. Unfortunately, it's difficult to have a pre-configured one. It's not, so someone's asked, is it just the September release that has these guides? This is actually the June release that we're looking at right now, but I'm not sure when the guides were added, but they're definitely there, at least in June. I'm pretty sure also in April, but I'm not sure. All right, and someone's also asked, how far back will the apps load data from? So the apps by default, I've got some notes on that back. Sorry, one moment. If we go back to this one, so by default, the operations monitor and the license monitor go back 3 months, and this is configurable in the script. And the other ones go back 7 days. No, sorry. The log monitor goes back 7 days. The sessions and reloads monitors go back 12 months. Can you set up can you set up the monitoring apps for multi-node in a single node environment where you're expecting to later add future nodes? Yes, if you're using the logging database. If you're not using the logging database, then it's hard to do that in advance. I mean, you can, because it involves modifying the load script, and setting that load script up in advance is kind of difficult since you need to also set up the data connections. It's really got to be done at the same time. All of the other components, so yeah, that works fine. So there was someone asking about support for analyzer and professional tokens. So my understanding is that support exists in the monitoring apps for June and September. I'm not sure. It's not available in the earlier versions, unfortunately, even though April supports that token type. The monitoring apps don't. So it should be available in June. Unfortunately, the environment I'm looking at is using the old token system, so I can't show that to you right now.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
All right.
I hope you enjoyed this session. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.